Greetings all, and welcome to the 9th episode of the V.T.P, or the Veteran Trainer's Perspective. Today, we are going to be taking a look at one of the most fundamental aspects of any Pokemon game, and probably the biggest choice that trainers of all types have to make at the very beginning of their journey. Today, we will be taking a look at Starter Pokémon through the generations, and how their functions and existence follow a specific theme that is distinct from one generation to the next. When players get the chance to start a new adventure in a Pokemon game, they are almost immediately provided with a single but incredibly important decision that can determine how the rest of the game plays out: choosing what starter Pokemon to go with. Now, for those who are new to the series, a starter Pokemon is one of 3 special Pokemon that are incredibly rare, usually to the point where you can only get one of them in the game, and are obtained at the very start of a game, with you usually having one of the 3 to choose from. Moreover, in almost every single instance, these Pokemon belong to one of 3 primary types: grass, fire, and water, and while they may or may not get additional types as they grow and develop, they always retain these primary types and are defined by them in turn. Now, for the main series games, the reason for this is to automatically instill the idea of type matchups and the concept of some types being stronger against others, something that we covered in detail in the last episode of the V.T.P. This is important, as type effectiveness is one of the core fundamental aspects that forms the backbone of Pokemon battling, so granting the player access to Pokemon that illustrate this and can grow up to eventually become quite powerful is an important step in introducing the mechanics of the games to beginning players. However, beneath this basic lesson, I have noticed that there are other patterns present in each generation that help to define not only the starters and the long-term usage in the games, but, likewise, the style of combat in the games and how it can shape the experience of players and frame the overall nature of the games and the journey they would take players on. It is here, today, that I will present you with these very patterns that I see, and show you just what kinds of interesting tricks and lessons that the starters of each generation play in order to show us just what each and every set of games is going to offer us in terms of both challenge and gameplay experience. Let's start off with where it all began, Generation 1, where our starters are the most classic of them all, the Bulbasaur, Charmander, and Squirtle families. These Pokemon help to shape the function of starter Pokemon as a whole, and the formula that would then be followed for the creation of more down the line, and are among the most beloved of Pokemon out there, the Charmander family especially. What most likely do not realize, however, is that these starters, at least in the original Generation 1 games, not only served as the backbone for showing how type advantages work in the games, even though the first battle with your rival does not clearly show this right away, as both of your Pokemon will only have access to basic physical attacks at that moment, something that will be repeated through almost all generations, but also served as the highlight of another fundamental aspect of how Pokemon can perform and function in battle: their stats. Every single species of Pokemon has base stats that ultimately determine how they are able to perform in battle, and can be affected by the IVs and EVs that are present and or otherwise invested into them, but the base stat values nonetheless provide a cap or barrier that keeps their stats from exceeding a certain value, and these stats are meant to be in combinations that are pretty much unique to every single species, at least for the most part. In their original state, the 3 starter Pokemon of Generation 1 all specialized in some different aspects of the stats of the games to highlight how they can affect the way in which certain Pokemon can be played. On the one hand, fully evolved, Venusaur by far has the strongest special stat of the trio, and thus shows how brute offense can work to one's advantage in a fight, can help to overcome those that otherwise have strong defenses and wipe the floor with lesser creatures. Of course, this is balanced out by limiting their access to useful, powerful moves of their type for some time, but the stats nonetheless illustrate this purpose. Blastoise, on the other hand, is on the opposite end of the spectrum, having the highest base defense stat out of the 3 original starters, and thus is designed to show how having a defensive Pokemon can help them weather the storm of basic blows and take much of what the games throw at it in stride, helping to make for a wall that can help teach the benefits of having high defenses when otherwise trying to counter offensively minded Pokemon, or otherwise just taking the blows of lesser foes with ease. Lastly, Charizard originally wasn't that strong on offense or defense, but instead specialized in speed, showing the fundamental importance of being able to get the first strike in battle, and thus showed how being fast, even if everything else isn't that great, can at least allow for faster initial hits and give some time to set up attacks and techniques to push the battle more in one's favor. It is also worth noting that, since critical hits were determined by speed in Generation 1, the Charmander family's eventual access to the slash attack gave them a major advantage over the other starters that could allow for some wicked damage to be dealt in spite of their otherwise mediocre base attack stat. As such, these three help to pave the way and illustrate just how stats can affect the course and duration of a battle and ultimately determine which Pokemon are simply naturally stronger than others with or without investment being put in to maximize their potential. Next, we move on to the starters of Generation 2, the Chikorita, Cyndaquil, and Totodile families. Comparing them to the previous generation set of starter Pokemon, one particular theme should be quite clear to see among these starters, and it is something so unique that it was never made a part of these sets ever again in the history of the franchise. The final evolutions of these three starters retain their status of being pure types, meaning that they have no secondary type assignments to them, and thus exist as perfect examples of what their types are supposed to represent in terms of type advantages and disadvantages. However, there is another theme to them that helps to frame the Generation 2 games as a whole. Compared to the first set of games, the Gym Leaders Elite Four and Champion featured in the original games have Pokemon that are of a much lower level than some might expect. And while this is at least partially because the second half of the game, though shorter, has you going back through the Kanto region for more challenges, there is also a noticeable issue with this compared to the starter Pokemon. The issue is the fact that the starter Pokemon don't get access to their best moves until they reach a level that is after the highest level of even the Pokemon possessed by the champion, Lance. The lower levels of the initial part of the game might make it look easier at first, but this is countered by the starters not being able to get their best and most powerful attacks until after the point where they would be the most useful. This helps to force trainers to reanalyze just what really makes the games difficult, eliminating level as the primary issue and showing them that more than just brute force might be needed to get through the game. I find this to actually be quite refreshing as a whole, and I think it was a good stepping stone in making the games deeper than they were in the first generation, as players were made painfully aware that simply spamming the strongest moves that Pokemon could get was no longer such an easy option, and that they would have to think carefully about how to make the most of the weaker attacks that even their starter Pokemon will likely have access to, even at what many might have assumed to be the end of the game before Kanto becomes a place available to explore. Next, we look at the Generation 3 starter Pokemon, with the Trico, Torchic, and Mudkip families. Because this generation was disconnected from the generation that came before it because of hardware issues, this was likely a fresh start for almost all players, so the starters really had to stand out to make them worth going for, and I think I can say that they succeeded, as these creatures are among the most popular of starter Pokemon and are in general quite powerful and useful to work with, also being among the few that eventually got access to Mega Evolutions. Interestingly, while there might not seem to be much of a common theme between them in terms of types or stats, there is something very important that they serve to highlight regarding the act of raising Pokemon: the moves that they learn. As it turns out, there is a unique dilemma surrounding the raising of these starter Pokemon because the moves that the first stage of each family gets and what the rest of the evolutions get are quite different from one another. With Trico, if they are prevented from evolving for a long time, they can get access to moves like Giga Drain that serve as a more useful counterpart to their stronger special offenses than the mostly physical moves that their evolutions get. Torchic can get access to moves like Flamethrower if left unevolved for a long time, while its evolutions mainly only get moves that are highlighted as being more physical, or at least nowadays after the physical special split that occurred in Generation 4. And lastly, Mudkip can get access to moves like Hydro Pump, the strongest move any member of their family can possibly get, while the evolutions lack their capacity and instead supplemented with physical attacks like Earthquake. As such, players are presented with a choice as to whether or not to keep their Pokemon from evolving. They can get access to some interesting moves that can work well in their favor, but they also miss out on many moves that the initial starter's evolutions can learn and not them. This adds a level of strategy and depth to the journey, as players have to decide what kinds of moves they want their starter Pokemon to have, and in turn helps them to study and learn how sometimes not going for evolution right away can and cannot have potential consequences that affects how these Pokemon can be utilized in a battle. Generation 4 was the first on the Nintendo DS line and was a very popular generation at that, introducing some of the most popular starter Pokemon in the form of the Turtwig, Chimchar, and Piplup families, all of which eventually evolve arguably into some of the best starter Pokemon to ever be created. What makes these three interesting, though, in my book, is that there is a pattern that both accentuates and betrays the primary lesson that starter Pokemon are supposed to teach. As mentioned before, the primary reason for having starter Pokemon belonging to the grass, fire, and water types is that the three form a triangle of type advantages and disadvantages with each other, to illustrate this important, fundamental aspect of combat. However, what these three starters in particular also demonstrate is that secondary type assignments can have a huge impact on the performance of a Pokemon even when it seems like their primary type puts them at a disadvantage. In essence, what I mean by this is that even though these Pokemon have primary types and moves that follow the normal pattern seen, their final evolutions all have secondary type assignments that work to counter their otherwise apparent weaknesses. While Torterra is a grass type and should be weak to the attacks of Infernape, at the same time it has an advantage in being a partial ground type and getting natural access to the Earthquake attack, dealing super effective damage against the Chimchar family. Infernape would normally be trounced by the water type powers of the Piplup family, but because they are partial fighting types and Empoleon are partial steel types, they can use their natural fighting type attacks to deal super effective damage. And lastly, while Empoleon normally would be terribly hurt by the grass type attacks of Torterra, because Torterra are partial ground types, they will actually take neutral damage from the water type moves of Empoleon. Plus, Empoleon's partial steel type assignment eliminates its weakness to the grass type and is complemented by moves like Drill Peck, balancing the two out somewhat. This as a whole helps to show the complexity that can come from having multiple type assignments, and is in turn a good start to understanding counter strategies that can make type matchups much trickier to take advantage of and ultimately master, to take down opponents that might otherwise have the upper hand on the basis of one of their types alone. Generation 5 was supposed to be a new start for the series in the way that its Pokemon were designed and the adventure played out, and in a similar way, the starters of this generation, the members of the Snivy, Tepig, and Oshawott families, are a classic remix on the original starter Pokemon in that they are designed to teach about how battle strategies work in a fight, though their existence places a slight twist on the meaning. Instead of this lesson being taught through the application of their base stats alone, this also applies to the way in which their stats as a whole are arranged, the moves they learn, and as a culmination of these factors, the types of strategies that can be used in order to make the most of them in battle. The members of the Snivy family, for instance, are all about speed, but this is compounded by the fact that their natural move variety is very limited, only giving them useful access to normal and grass-type attacks for offense. As such, they really can't do much against those they have a type disadvantage against, so they cannot easily defeat all opponents on their own. This places them more as a supportive fighter, and shows how a team must be built around them in order to make the most of their power and help counter the glaring issues present in the family's capacity to effectively handle other Pokemon. The members of the Tepig family, on the other hand, illustrate the opposite of this, as they are powerful fighters with great offensive stats and access to a wide variety of different moves as they grow and develop, even having access to a signature move in the form of the Heat Crash attack. These beasts are perfect for those that like to use brute strength to get through fights, and more than have the power needed to make it work, even if this is countered by them being on the slow side and having very limited defenses. The Oshawott family, then, exists as a middle ground to all of this, as while they are not as offensively powerful as the Tepig family or as fast as the Snivy family, they have a good balance of stats in all categories and learn a decent variety of moves to make use of in battle. As such, they serve as a useful middle ground that can help players get the full experience if they wish to, and the starters as a whole offer a nice balanced set that can show what types of strategies do and do not work in certain combat situations as players go through the Generation 5 games. Generation 6 brought to the table a lot of interesting things, most exciting of all the introduction of the Fairy type, but this wasn't the only thing to get a serious upgrade, as the starters of this region, the members of the Chespin, Fennekin, and Froakie families, had two special attributes going for them. For one thing, they all introduced unique type combinations that had never been on starters before, and they were all able to make good use of their new types to prove to be formidable foes to have to face in many ways. They also shared an emphasis on stats, with Chestnut being strong in its physical stats, Delphox its special ones, and Greninja with a slight mix of both but a focus on speed. This is, however, not the one thing that truly cements them as unique. What does, however, is a factor that has so far been continued with in Generation 7, potentially introducing a new permanent factor that helps the starters really stand out from other Pokemon. Signature moves. While they are now accessible to other Pokemon, limited as they may be, when these starters debuted in Generation 6, they all had a special move that only their fully evolved forms could get access to immediately upon evolving into an adult state, and they worked to make them more special than others, with Chestnut getting the spiky shield technique and Delphox and Greninja getting the mystical fire and water shuriken attacks, respectively. These moves were not only incredibly dangerous by themselves, but they nonetheless helped to make the starters stand out from other Pokemon in the games, and thus made it more enticing to want to keep training them over the course of a long adventure, something that was likely needed as a rebuttal against the sheer volume of Pokemon available to capture in Pokemon X and Y, helping to cement the starters as Pokemon worth carrying around and training for the long haul. Lastly, we have the most recent addition of starters to the series in Generation 7, with the members of the Rowlet, Litten, and Popplio families. These creatures do not tend to show a severe form of specialization over one another in terms of their stats or moves, and their overall effectiveness really depends on their combat situation, but these creatures offer something particularly interesting that helps to round them out as a whole. Refreshed type assignments that ultimately serve as the biggest source of power as a whole. The type assignments given to these creatures, while not completely original or unique by themselves, do more than just make them unique among starters. Combined with their stats, they make them all a potential threat alongside the bag of tricks that each has to bear, and in turn can make them all living statements of expecting the unexpected. Decidueye has a good mix of stats as a whole, and is able to make good use of its signature Spirit Shackle attack to both deal damage and keep opponents from easily escaping. But at the same time it is rendered an unexpected factor as they go from Grass Flying in evolution to being Grass Ghost, a unique type combination that switches around what most players might be used to dealing with, and thus offers a new pathway for players to play the Pokemon down. Litten and its evolution, Torracat, start out as speed-oriented fighters with some decent attacks to work with, but as soon as they evolve into Incineroar, they become Fire-Dark types, and they actually lose a lot of their speed, having it replaced with powerful offenses and surprising bulk, allowing these creatures to suddenly become capable of both dishing out and taking damage readily, and of such a great and wide array of moves at their disposal after evolution that they, alongside their signature Darkest Lariat attack, can use this shift in needed tactics to become powerful bruisers that can easily take a hit and dish it right back out. And last but certainly not least, when Popplio finally get the chance to fully evolve into Primarina, they gain a partial Fairy type assignment, being the only Fairy type starter Pokemon to ever be introduced, and their special stats increase to dramatic levels, making them both a powerful wall against and deliverer of special attacks, more so than any other starter Pokemon known. This, in turn, combined with their unique Sparkling Aria attack, helps to make them strange but useful creatures that can help heal the burns of allies in battle at the cost of some damage to them, and prove to be dangerous fighters to have to contend with. As a whole, these starters might lead trainers to think that they know what they are going to get in the end, but they throw a lovely and pleasant curveball to them instead, and keep trainers guessing as to what kind of power the starter will actually get after they have fully evolved. In concluding this, we now have a better idea of the major themes that are played out in the starter Pokemon available in each generation, and how they act to make each generation feel distinct and set up the general playstyle for every set of games. They might not always play to a style that veteran or novice trainers individually are able to handle initially, but they always provide for a unique gameplay experience that keeps people coming back for more each and every time a new set of games is released. It is likely that these sorts of pattern formations will only continue into the future, and through the starter Pokemon, we can see a bit of what every generation will be about, and use that to inform our decisions as to how to adapt our gameplay style to make the most of said games when they come out. Tune in next time for another episode of the V.T.P, and prepare for a special episode that may very well make you question at least one of the oldest Pokemon fan theories. For next time, we are blowing the lid off of the Great Pokemon War. Until then, keep on watching and enjoy! Thank you all for watching this video. It is always an honor to be able to speak with you all on the subject of Pokemon in a way that brings me great joy and happiness in my work. If you would like to keep tabs on past and future work, click that subscribe button, check out my work on DeviantArt, and don't be shy about following me on Twitter, where you can find pertinent announcements on upcoming work before it is officially posted. Links to both can be found in the video description. If you would like to support my work and help Miguel and I continue to produce more content for you and improve upon our presentation, please visit us at my Patreon page, which you can also find a link to in the video description.
Yeah, no.
With that, I thank you for watching and I wish you well.